Caught between loyalty and love, James stood at a crossroads that tore his heart apart. On one side was his father, bound by duty, expectation, and years of silent sacrifice. On the other was Diep, the woman who carried his hope, his peace, and his future. Choosing a path meant breaking something within himself, and James knew that no matter which way he turned, his heart would bleed.
The morning light crept quietly through the thin curtains, pale and hesitant, as if it too was unsure whether it should wake the house. James sat alone on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, staring at a place on the floor that held nothing, yet somehow carried the weight of his entire life. Outside, the world was waking up in familiar ways. Distant footsteps, a vendor's call fading down the road, the soft clatter of everyday routines. Everything sounded normal, too normal for a heart already bleeding. James had learned long ago that silence could be louder than shouting. It was the kind of silence his father mastered, the kind that controlled without words, demanded obedience without explanation. From childhood, James had lived beneath that silence, mistaking it for strength, for protection. His father believed money could smooth every wound, power could rewrite every truth, and for years, James had believed him too. Until Diep. Diep entered his life quietly, like a breeze slipping through an open window. She didn't demand answers or make promises she couldn't keep. She spoke with her hands, with her patience, with the way she waited even when waiting hurt. With her, life slowed down. Simple meals tasted warmer. Even exhaustion felt shared. For the first time, James understood that love did not need permission. It only needed courage. But courage, James realized, often came at a cost.
His father's disapproval arrived not as a storm, but as a steady pressure, relentless, suffocating. "Choose wisely," his father had said, voice calm, eyes cold. There were no raised voices, no threats spoken aloud. There didn't need to be. The message was clear. Family loyalty was not negotiable, and love was a weakness that could be corrected. James felt torn in two, as if each step toward Diep pulled him further away from the man who raised him, and each step back toward his father erased the man he was becoming. At night, he lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of the world, wondering how something so simple, loving someone, could feel like betrayal. Diep sensed the change before he ever spoke of it. She noticed it in the pauses between his words, in the way his smile no longer reached his eyes. She didn't press him, she only stayed, and that somehow hurt the most. Because James knew that the path forming before him would not let everyone remain standing. To choose his father was to lose himself. To choose Diep was to bleed, slowly, deeply, but honestly. And as the morning light finally filled the room, James understood one cruel truth. Some choices do not break the world apart. They break the heart instead.
By noon, the town was alive with noise, yet James felt as though he were walking underwater. Voices reached him in fragments, laughter from a small cafe, the clang of metal from a construction site, the casual conversations of strangers who did not know what it meant to stand at the edge of a choice that could ruin you. Life, he noticed bitterly, did not pause for broken hearts. He met his father in an office that smelled of polished wood and old authority. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, reflecting off framed achievements on the wall, silent witnesses to a life built on control and sacrifice. His father sat behind the desk, posture firm, eyes sharp despite the calm expression he wore. There was no greeting, only a long look, the kind that weighed a person before they spoke. "You've been distracted," his father said at last. James swallowed. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, yet every word felt wrong now that it mattered. "I'm trying to live honestly," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. His father leaned back, fingers interlaced. "Honesty doesn't feed families. Stability does. You know what's at stake." And James did know. He knew about the company, the reputation, the invisible chains of gratitude that bound him to a man who had given him everything, except freedom. His father spoke not in anger, but in logic,
slicing through James's emotions with careful precision. Love was temporary, he insisted. Power endured. Diep, in his father's eyes, was a detour, nothing more.
As James listened, memories flooded back, long nights studying under his father's watchful gaze, lessons disguised as commands, praise given only when obedience was complete. He had grown strong there, but also small. When James finally stood to leave, his father's voice followed him. Think carefully. Some doors, once closed, will never open again. Outside, the sky was heavy with gray clouds. James walked without direction until he found himself at the edge of the market. There, among baskets of vegetables and the soft bargaining of sellers, he saw Diep. She was helping an elderly woman, her movements gentle, her smile real. In that ordinary moment, something inside him broke. She looked up and met his eyes. No questions, no accusations, just understanding and hope. James realized then that his heart had already chosen. Yet choosing did not mean escaping pain. It meant accepting it. As thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, James stood between two worlds, one built on fear and obligation, the other on love and uncertainty. And though his feet remained still, his heart was already bleeding, each drop marking the cost of becoming his own man.
That night, rain fell softly, as if the sky itself were unsure whether to cry or to stay silent. James sat alone in the small room he now called home, listening to the steady rhythm of water tapping against the roof. It reminded him of childhood evenings, when storms would pass and his father would sit nearby, saying nothing, believing that presence alone was enough. Back then, James had mistaken silence for strength. The memory stirred something restless in him. He thought of Diep, her hands rough from work, her voice calm even when life was unfair. She had never asked him to choose, never demanded promises he could not keep. And yet every time she looked at him, he felt the weight of a future pressing gently against his chest, asking only one thing: honesty. Earlier that evening, Diep had spoken quietly as they walked along the narrow road leading home. The street lights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched and shrank with each step. "You don't have to decide everything tonight," she said. "Sometimes living is also a kind of courage." Her words lingered now, echoing louder than his father's warnings. James realized how different their strengths were. His father's strength was built from walls, thick, unyielding, meant to protect but also to imprison. Diep's strength was like water, soft enough to flow around obstacles, yet powerful enough to wear them down over time. Still, fear crept in. What would happen if he let go of everything he had been taught to hold on to? If he chose Diep, would he become weak in his father's eyes? Or worse, irrelevant? James clenched his fists, then slowly relaxed them. For the first time, he admitted the truth he had been avoiding. He was already lost in this father's world, slowly fading into a version of himself he barely recognized. Staying would not save him. It would erase him. He stepped outside, letting the rain soak his hair and clothes. The cold bit into his skin, sharp and awakening. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a motorbike passed, life continuing in its ordinary, stubborn way. People everywhere were choosing, failing, loving, starting over. Why should he be any different? James closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The answer rose within him, quiet but firm. He did not want a life that looked perfect from the outside and empty from within. He wanted mornings filled with simple laughter, tired evenings shared in silence, and the freedom to fall and rise again as his own man. When the rain finally eased, James felt lighter, though nothing had been resolved yet. He knew the road ahead would hurt. There would be losses, arguments, and moments of regret, but there would also truth. And for the first time in a long while, James understood that bleeding did not always mean dying.
Sometimes it was the first sign that the heart was finally alive.
Morning arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if it sensed the fragile decision that had been made in the night. The sky was pale, the air still damp from yesterday's rain, and the world looked newly washed, simple, honest, unforgiving. James stood by the window, watching people begin their day. A woman swept her doorstep. A child ran after a ball that refused to stay still. Life moved forward without waiting for anyone's pain to settle. That was when James understood. Choices do not ask for permission. They arrive unannounced and demand to be lived with. He went to see his father just before noon. The house felt smaller than he remembered, heavy with unspoken expectations. His father sat in the same chair, his posture rigid, his eyes sharp but tired. For a moment, James almost turned back. The old fear rose in his chest, familiar and persuasive. But then he thought of Diep, standing in the early light, waiting, not because she was weak, but because she believed love could outlast fear. "I'm leaving," James said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Silence followed, not the gentle silence of understanding, but the cold kind that cuts deeper than anger. His father's face tightened, disappointment settling like a final verdict. Words were spoken, sharp, unforgiving, but James barely heard them. He had already crossed the invisible line. There was no victory in that room, only loss. Yet strangely, there was also relief. When James stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds. It was not dramatic, not bright enough to erase the pain, but real. He walked until his legs ached, until the past felt farther behind him. Every step carried doubt, but also a strange sense of belonging to himself. Diep was waiting at the edge of the field, just as she always had. She did not run to him. She did not cry. She simply looked at him, searching his face for the truth. James nodded once. That was enough. They walked together in silence, hands brushing, hearts still fragile. The future was uncertain. There would be days when money was short, when regret whispered late at night, when the shadow of his father's rejection returned uninvited. But there would also be mornings like this, quiet, honest, shared. James realized then that bleeding hearts do heal, but only when they are allowed to love freely. And Diep, with her quiet patience, was not the reason he lost his old world. She was the reason he finally found a new one.
This story reminds us that love and loyalty are often tested not by strangers, but by the people closest to us. James's pain did not come from hatred or betrayal, but from being forced to choose between obedience and authenticity. Many of us face similar moments in life, when expectations from family, society, or tradition clash with what our hearts quietly know to be true. The lesson here is not that family should be abandoned, nor that love should demand sacrifice without thought. Instead, it teaches us that real love does not imprison, it gives courage. Diep did not pressure James or beg him to stay. Her strength lay in patience, respect, and unwavering faith. Through her, James learned that love is not loud promises or dramatic gestures, but the quiet willingness to wait, to believe, and to stand firm without control. Another important lesson is that choosing your own path often comes with loss. Doing the right thing does not guarantee applause or approval. Sometimes it brings loneliness, misunderstanding, and guilt. But living a life that is not truly yours will slowly drain your spirit. Pain faced honestly is lighter than comfort built on fear. Finally, this story reminds us that healing begins when we are brave enough to be ourselves. Hearts may bleed, relationships may fracture, but integrity allows us to rebuild. When we choose love rooted in respect and truth, even the most painful decisions can lead us towards peace. In the end, courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing love despite it.